TFA fam, week 11 is upon us. The fantasy playoffs are near, so let's not waste any time. Let's jump into our top 24 running back rankings for week 11. Kick it off with our RB1s. They are as follows. No surprise with Christian McCaffrey at the top, followed by Austin Eckler, Travis Etienne, Josh Jacobs, Brees Hall, Jameer Gibbs, Devon Achane, DeAndre Swift, Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Kenneth Walker, and Brian Robinson making his way into our RB1s for the week. Kev, what do the folks need to know about the RB1s for week 11?
Yeah, for me, when you look at some of these running backs this week, I mean, I think there's some guys in some really good spots. First off, I want to hit on DeAndre Swift. He plays the Kansas City Chiefs in a Super Bowl rematch on the road. Swift has been the Eagles' primary back for most of the season. He's handling about 61% of the snaps, 70% of the rush attempts, and 52% of the routes with a 12% target share. He is currently the RB13 in fantasy points per game. He hasn't been the most efficient with his touches, though. I will say that he's been much more of a volume-based running back. He's 26th in explosive run rate, 37th in missed tackles forced per attempt, and 32nd in yards after contact per attempt. Now, on the surface, I think if you just look at the raw numbers, you'd think this is not a great matchup for him this week. But over the last 4 weeks, if you kind of zoom in here on the Chiefs, they've allowed the 6th most rushing yards per game at a 4.70 yards per carry average over that same span. They have also allowed the 14th highest explosive run rate and the 8th worst stuff rate with the 5th highest yards after contact per attempt. So while in the season they have allowed the 11th fewest fantasy points to running backs, that has started to fall off and regress to some regard. So I do actually think this is a sneaky good matchup here for DeAndre Swift. So let's keep it moving. Let's move over to Jameer Gibbs. And my oh my, has he went off recently. Week 10, we saw him it was even surprising because I think some people thought maybe Monty would come back in and kind of take this backfield back from him, which wasn't the case. He played 58% of the snaps, 45% of the rush tips, 64% of the routes with a 16% target share. He also played 56% of the long down and distance snaps. Tamani's only played 38% of the snaps and 39% of the rush attempts. He did have that long touchdown run that kind of got him there. But now, over the last 4 weeks, Jameer Gibbs has been phenomenal. He's been the RB1 over that span, averaging 100 rushing yards per game and a touchdown per game. He also ranks first in yards after contact per attempt, second in missed tackles forced per attempt, and first in explosive run rate over that same span. Now, same thing we kind of talked about with this Bears team last week is the same thing I want to talk about this week. This is a terrible matchup for David Montgomery. The Bears have been phenomenal against the run this year. Over the last 4 weeks, the Bears are only allowing 55.8 rushing yards per game and at the 2.72 yards per carry average. Their 60.5% stuff rate is best in the league over that span. When you're listening to your second favorite fantasy show this week and people tell you he's a great play for David Montgomery, remember this information. How you beat the Bears while they allow the 13th most fantasy points per game is because they have been torched through the air. They have allowed by far the most receiving yards to the position, and they have yielded the most receiving touchdowns as well to running back. So that is why Jameer Gibbs is ranked so high, because what he does best is obviously catch passes out of the backfield. Obviously, he's been phenomenal, on the ground as well. But with a 16% target share last rate, ran 64% of the routes. David Montgomery only ran 30% of the routes with 0% target share. So that makes Jameer Gibbs a great play against this defense. But David Montgomery, if all he's going to be is the grinder back, this is a terrible matchup. Sure, he could fall his way into the end zone for a touchdown or two and become fantasy relevant. I still think he's a low-end RB2, but there's going to be a lot of people hyping up David Montgomery this week, saying he's a top 12 running back, and he's not. So I just wanted to mention that when it comes to with this situation, it's not as good as what it looks like on paper. The Bears like I said, have been phenomenal against running backs this year on the ground. They have been torched through the air. Lastly, Brian Robinson. We've been here before this year having him as an RB1. It didn't work so well. Hopefully it works better the second time around. But last week was a wild ride for Brian Robinson. Robinson went off last week as the RB1 on the week, but it was not how we typically see him have success. He handled 57% of the rush attempts, but saw a season-high 15% target share, and he did with over 100 receiving yards on 6 receptions and a score. But over his last 4 games, he is the RB14, averaging 14.7 PPR points. This is a great game script against the Giants this week. That one that should be heavily favored the Commanders and Brian Robinson. The Giants have allowed the second most rushing yards and the second most rushing touchdowns on the season. Over their last 4 games, the Giants have allowed 7 rushing touchdowns, 106.8 rushing yards per game, and they've allowed the 10th highest explosive run rate and the 13th in yards after contact per attempt. Brian Robinson is setting up to be a phenomenal play again this week against the Giants.
The only thing I'll add in here before we move on to the RB2s is we have to pay attention to what happens with Raheem Mostert this week. They came out of their bye. We still don't know why he didn't practice, but he did not practice on Monday. I haven't seen any updates as far as what has happened to him or why he did not practice. But Achan should be back. So if Mostert is out or limited, this is going to be a great spot for Achan going up against the Raiders. So really exciting spot for him to walk back into for those who have had him either stashed on their IR or sitting at the end of their bench. So really like him this week. Let's go ahead and go into our RB2s, followed with Raheem Mostert at 13, Tony Pollard at 14, Joe Mixon, Aaron Jones, Javonte Williams, David Montgomery, Isaiah Pacheco, Ty Chandler, James Cook, James Conner, Devin Singletary, and Rashad White, rounding out our RB2s for the week. Kev, same deal. Who do we need to know about?
Ty Chandler versus Denver. Now, this is a spot that I can get behind, but this will largely depend on Alexander Madison. But we've only seen one player return the week after a concussion. It seems highly unlikely that Madison will be ready to return this week, which should open the door for Ty Chandler to see a massive workload. Denver has really been bad against running backs, even though they have recently improved. However, they still struggle against the run. They have allowed the eighth most rushing yards per game. The 5.51 yards per carry allowed is the highest rate in the league. Their 33.8% stuff rate is also the lowest in the league. Long story short, the Broncos are a great matchup for Ty Chandler to exploit. He is a high-end RB2 this week against this Denver Broncos team. Let's move over to James Cook. The committee has been frustrating for James Cook this year for limiting his ceiling. Last week, he only handled 48% of the snaps and rush attempts. He also only ran 33% of the routes, but he did see a 12% target share. Some of this could have been because of the fumbles that caused him to get benched, but this is a trend that we have seen all season. With limited touches, he's been efficient. He's 10th in missed tackles forced per attempt, 5th in yards after contact per attempt. However, over the last 4 games, he's only averaging 12.1 PPR points per game, which ranks 20th. The Jets' defense has been the sole purpose that they're even staying afloat. However, one area they have struggled with has been against running backs. Over their last 4 games, they have allowed 145 rushing yards per game, which is 4th worst rate in the league. They have also allowed the 4th highest missed tackles forced per attempt and the 9th highest yards after contact per attempt. So this is actually a good matchup here for the running backs on the ground. Obviously, we're going to always have to deal with Josh Allen and his ability to run the football and also take away goal line touches. But this is still a good matchup for James Cook. I think he's a pretty solid RB2 play this week. Javonte Williams, we said it last week. I said he was back. I think he pretty much solidified that with his 21 fantasy point production that he just had, and now he is the RB9 over the last 4 games, averaging 17.5 fantasy points per game. Returning from their Week 9 bye, Javonte once again handled the majority of the touches with a 62% rushing share and a very healthy 14% target share against the Bills. Over his last 4 games, he's also 7th in yards after contact per attempt and 5th in explosive run rate. Minnesota, though, I will say this. The reason I have him lower, because it's a lot of other people, I probably would have him as a top 12 running back this week, much like I did last week. But this is a very tough matchup. Minnesota has been very good against the run. They've allowed the 4th fewest rushing yards per game, the 7th lowest explosive run rate, and the 10th lowest yards after contact per attempt. Devontae will have to get there purely off volume this week, but I would lower expectations with this is a very tough matchup against the Vikings. Keep it moving. Isaiah Pacheco, same situation. Do not have high expectations for Pacheco, who struggled recently and now takes on a defense that has been stingy when it comes to running backs. They have allowed the 3rd fewest rushing yards per game, as well as the 7th highest stuff rate. Pacheco can always get there through touchdowns because of the offense he's playing in. But overall, this is the best matchup for Pacheco and the Chiefs coming off their bye. James Conner, first game back last week with the Cardinals, wasn't great as he managed only 7 PPR points. However, the volume was very nice. He played 63% of the snaps, 67% of the rush attempts, and a 39% of the routes. Most people will look at this matchup on paper and think it's an elite matchup. However, the Texans have improved against opposing running back. Over their past 4 games, the Texans have been much better against the run. They have allowed the 2nd fewest rushing yards per game and the lowest yards per carry average. They also have the 2nd best stuff rank over that span. If Connor's going to meet value, he will have to find a touchdown. They've allowed the 10th highest touchdown rate to running backs over that same span. Connor's appeal with this week is volume, but the matchup be damned. Connor is still a middling RB2 this week against the Texans. On the opposite side of the game is Devin Singletary. Is coming off a solid game with an insane workload. He played 81% of the snaps, 91% of the rush attempts, and 56% of the routes. He turned that volume into 23 PPR. Dameon Pierce missed every practice last week. It's entirely possible he will miss another week. The reason he's ranked here is because of the uncertainty with Pierce. Without him, he's a high-end RB2. With him, he's more of a low-end RB2. The Cardinals struggle against the run, allowing 135.5 rushing yards per game, which is the 7th highest rate in the league. Their 4.2% touchdown rate allowed is also the 9th highest rate in the league. No matter what happens with Pierce, Singletary is still a very good option this week. So, and that kind of wraps up the RB2s that I really want to hit on.
Let's wrap it up with some guys we have outside of our top 24. Now, technically, Jerome Ford for us is RB 25, although we both have him ranked at 23 for the week. Not a great matchup. The Steelers have been better against the run the past couple of weeks. They held Aaron Jones in check, but we did just see Jerome Ford rattle off over 100 rushing yards against the Ravens. So if they can get him going, I think Jerome Ford is in an interesting spot here. And then Zach Charbonnet, I know a lot of people have been talking about, myself included, how Charbonnet has outsnapped Kenneth Walker over, I think, 3 straight weeks now. But a lot of that has to do with the game script that they have been in. It hasn't necessarily resulted in Charbonnet like really taking over this backfield, right? Like the volume isn't necessarily lining up with the amount of snaps that he is getting over Kenneth Walker. So I just wanted to throw that out there as something for people to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think people are kind of just digging into that one stat and overlooking everything else that's actually going on
Yeah.
between those two. So, I just got a couple of situations I want to hit on. Daryl Henderson and Royce Freeman. They're essentially splitting work 50-50. Henderson did play 62% of the snaps last time we saw them. However, Freeman handled 50% of the rush attempts. This week, the Rams take on a Seahawks defense that has been absolutely smashed by opposing running backs the last 4 weeks. They have allowed 162 rushing yards per game with a ridiculous 5.40 yards per carry. They have also allowed the highest yards after contact per attempt and the highest explosive run rate. Without being able to predict which one of these running backs will see the most work, they both make for fine RB3/flex options this week. Also, should mention that Matthew Stafford is expected to return for this game as well, so that should help out with this offense as well. Let's keep it moving. Let's talk about Najee Harris, Jalen Warren. Now, this is a tougher matchup this week against the Browns. They have allowed the 17th most rushing yards per game. However, they have allowed third highest stuff rate. But if you get past the line of scrimmage, they do allow the 12th highest yards after contact per attempt. So Najee Harris, Jalen Warren, both of them have been pretty suitable the last couple of weeks. I'm just a little bit lower on them. I don't think they're as good of plays and good of spots here against the Browns. And then Khalil Herbert. Herbert was close to returning last week, but they held him out one more game. He's able to return this week. I would be a bit hesitant to insert him back into my starting lineup with Deonta Foreman playing well and Roshan Johnson still being involved. This could be a three-way committee. It might be smart to avoid all of them for now with a matchup against the Lions. So, I think you could look at him as kind of like a low-end RB3 if you absolutely needed him. You could plug him in there, but I just don't feel truly confident with him this week in this matchup. So, that being said, if you haven't already, hit that like and subscribe button for future content. Let us know in the comment section below any start set situations you may have among your running backs. We'll help you out. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.